Our next example of a novelty is the insect wing. Now we can classify all wings as novel features. However, even though some of the steps along the way may be unknown, the origin of the three vertebrate wings is not really a huge mystery, right? So the pterosaur, as pictured here in the top left, which was first, the birds, which were dinosaurs that evolved the ability to fly, and more recently the bats. All of the three other instances of flight in the history of life on Earth evolved from the vertebrate forelimb. They are modifications of the forelimb, different modifications of course, but modifications, and we can still homologize bones. So we've got humerus, radius, ulna, metacarpals, and tarsals, and sorry, that's in the feet. Anyway, we've got all of the finger bones, right, the phalanges. So we've got all of these forelimb structures that, although modified, most of them are still there. And so it's easy to see what structure changed and evolved. And so their origin, although the steps might be a bit unclear, the origin is not a huge mystery. However, insects are a little bit different. And insect wings are varied. They are incredibly diverse. And not only do they serve functions for flight, but also can serve for communication, for stabilization during flight, for protection like beetle wings. Butterfly wings are for many forms of communication. So they're really a diverse and successful structure that really is a key innovation, maybe more than anything else, though there are other contributing features, but more than anything else, probably wings are the defining key innovation for insects. The early insects did not have wings, and once wings originate, insects become incredibly diverse and successful and then continue to build on that. Now, wings in insects were the very first flying structure to evolve. The other wings came much later. So insects for many millions of years were the only flying things on the planet. And if we look at insect wings, they're a little bit more like almost like a dragon wing or Pegasus wing, meaning that they are structures that really don't have any clear predecessor amongst the close relatives. So if we look at the close relatives of insects, they have a head, a thorax with 6 legs, an abdomen, and they're missing wings. They don't have any sort of structure there that very obviously became the wing. And so for a long time, the origin of wings was a mystery. And even today, it remains somewhat controversial, although we'll talk about hypotheses and some of the evidence and data that supports these. There's still not a clear single answer to where insect wings came from. So if we look at the limited fossil evidence for the earliest insects, they all had no wings, although some of them had structures that were on the individual segments. Some of these were abdominal structures. And then we see this interesting thing in the earliest winged insects, that they have what almost looks like a third pair of wings on the prothorax. So insect thoraces are divided into 3 main segments: the prothorax, the metathorax, mesothorax, and then the metathorax. And so you don't need to know those names, but 1, 2, and 3. And in modern insects, wings or wing structures only appear on the middle and the hind thoracic segments. We don't have any wings on the prothoracic segment. But some of the fossil evidence show these hints of things that might be leftovers from early wings. So there's some debate about this still, but the earliest insects may have had 3 pairs of wings that were later reduced to just 2. But certainly 2 pairs of wings as an important functional breakthrough. That's the ground plan for insects, and all modern insects have derived from that. Some insects have modified those wings to the point where they no longer even serve as wings. In some groups, like flies, the hind wings no longer serve as wings. They just rely on their wings on the middle thoracic segment for lift. But despite those modifications, they all come from this 2-wing ground plan. So this bit of evidence and the fact that we see some projections from other segments led to the first hypothesis about where wings came from. And we're going to call this first hypothesis the paranodal theory. So this is diagrammed here on the left. This is a artist's reconstruction of a fossil insect that is falling or jumping out of an elevated position and has a little bit of a glide. So maybe rather than falling straight down, or maybe to slow their rate of descent, they had these paranodal projections. And on the fossils, these are not wings, but they look a little bit like wing shapes, and they are in the same place, including this prothoracic one there. And so the idea is that these projections along the side of the thorax, basically if we think of each insect segment like a box, these would be extensions of that top layer, or the top level of the box, and would have provided some functional and perhaps a stepwise adaptive trail towards folded wings. Now, there are some issues with this. In modern insects, and most likely in these first ancient insects, these paranoda were not innervated, so they didn't have nerves. They didn't have muscles. They were basically just like static wings. Think of them almost like wings on an airplane. Now, obviously, modern insect wings are very, very different. They're mobile, they're innervated, they can move up and down, and are very complex controlled. So we don't know whether it's possible, or at least the steps along the way, to move from a paranotum that's fixed and just basically part of the exoskeleton to one that is mobile and innervated and as complex as wings. Okay? So a competing hypothesis is that wings evolved as modification of gills that were present along the entire thorax and abdomen. So everywhere behind the head, the idea is that some of these ancient insects had gills there, and these gills evolved stepwise, and so they would have had all the basic building blocks for modern wings. They would have been roughly the same shape. There are still some gills today in living insects in the abdomen that look like this, although not in the thorax. The idea is the thorax ones became modified. They're innervated, they're musculated, they have trachea for distribution of gases, so they have all the features that wings need, and they would have evolved into wings in the thorax. Now, this one is not really supported by the fossil record. We really don't have good evidence of any transitional forms. We don't have any with wing-like. So this is really an image here that is very speculative, and this is not a reconstruction of an actual fossil. In addition to that, the gills are located more ventrally, not on the dorsal part where the wings are connected, but more down at the bottom of each segment. And so this one, both phylogenetically and the fossil record, this one's not very well supported. However, when people began to look at gills in close relatives, in crustaceans, and in insects, they noticed that there were genetic similarities in the earliest developmental steps of both gills and wings. And so that gave a little bit of a genetic connection, maybe one of these deep homology type things, where there is some genetic connection. Now, the trick is trying to understand whether that genetic connection could have arisen via convergence, or whether it was a co-option, or in other words, borrowing. So perhaps a primitive paranodal segment borrowed there was a mutation that turned on gill genes. And so this has led to this third one, or combined. Now, there are various versions of these combined, and we're not going to get into too much detail, but in essence, they say maybe it was part paranotum and part gill that together allowed the wings to form. And that, in recent years, has been proposed and has gained a little bit of purchase, but there's still not a lot of evidence for any one of the three. So really, we still don't know for sure. The paranodal theory is supported by the fossil record and the position. The gill theory is supported by the genes, at least the primitive genes, although there are some difficulties in making that a very firm connection. So in short, we still don't have a good firm answer about where insect wings come from. So they remain somewhat more of a mystery, and thus a little bit maybe more of a true novelty than the other three forms of flight that all evolved from the vertebrate forelimb. Okay? So fossil evidence supports this, phylogenetic reconstruction supports this also, and the gill theory is not very well supported except by the genes. Not only that, and this may or may not lend support to this gene theory, this gene data that supports the gill theory. So if we look at these epipods, these gills, the same basic early gene patterns are expressed in them as in the wings. And so we already talked about that. Now these guys are very, very distantly related, and we don't have as much or good evidence from the non-flying insects because they don't have these gills. They've lost them, or there's some debate as to whether the ancestor of all insects even had them. Perhaps gills were lost early on, which poses a major issue to the gill, excuse me, to the gill origin. Sorry, still getting over a little bit of this. Now, this is the interesting thing. If we look at book gills, which are very different and distantly related structure found on some chelicerets, like horseshoe crabs, and if we look at both book lungs and spider spinnerets, we see the same basic early gene. So the idea that these gills, which are associated with crustacean legs, evolved into wings, maybe provides that. But if so, then perhaps these other structures, the spinnerets, the book lungs, the book gills, all evolved from that ancient primitive gill-like structure. So either they've all evolved from this structure and it's just an example of deep homology with wide divergence of these structures, or there's been some level of co-option, borrowing of a genetic network to build these very different structures. And so we can see this is just a gene staining looking at one of these early gill genes that is also expressed in the early insect wing. So you don't need to memorize these names. However, they're interesting. They have names that were originally given because of the fruit fly mutant. So nubbin, the mutant of that, grows these little nubs of wings only partially formed. And Apterus, the mutant for that one, basically grows no wings at all. This comes from the Greek word a, meaning not, and teres, meaning wing, so not winged. So they have similar expression domains. And of course, spinnerets, this is a beautiful, falsely colored, but a beautiful SEM, one small portion of a spider spinnerets, with the purple being the silk, the green and brown being these little structures that exude the silk. And they also show these same patterns. So the jury is still out, but there's some data that is not definitive about these relationships. So almost certainly the earliest aquatic arthropod ancestor had these gills. Whether these gills were then lost in the ancestor of the insect and then maybe their networks were co-opted to build the wings, or whether those were maintained a long period of time and then just lost in some of the terrestrial non-winged insects, we don't really know. So the jury is still out a little bit. So insect wings remain something of a mystery, but you should be familiar with the two theories and the third theory, that it might be a combination of both the paranodal and the gill theory.